support of a $15 minimum wage. Joining me for the domestic hour, the Friday News Roundup, John Harwood of CNBC, Olivier Knox of Yahoo News, and for the first time, the Friday News Roundup, we welcome Dana Bash of CNN. Welcome, Dana. And you are welcome as well to join us. 800-433-8850. Send an email to drshow@wamu.org. Follow us on Facebook or send us a tweet. And it's good to see all of you.
Thanks, Diane. Good to see you.
Great to be here.
Happy springtime.
Happy springtime indeed. You know, I had an email this morning from someone who said, I'm already tired of 2016.
Maybe it was me.
So let's begin with how Hillary began, John.
It was a little odd. She announced by social media over the weekend, put out a video, put a Facebook message out, had a rather strange drive from New York out to Iowa. Not quite sure what the point of that was, but her aides say that Hillary wanted to do it. But then she started having events in Iowa, and I think this was very good Hillary Clinton in those events. She, one of the questions about her, it's not about her intellect or her capacity to do the job, but it's about how does she relate to ordinary people? How does she come across? She was very much at ease. This was the most relaxed that I've seen her as a candidate. Long way to go, early days, but it was a constructive start, I think, from her point of view.
What about positions, Dana?
Her positions?
Yeah.
Well, that's going to be the question in the primary that is going to continue to sort of nip at her heels. The fact that she, in her listening session, made a point of talking about issues like income inequality and understanding the disparity between CEOs and working people and so forth. I mean, that's something she needs to say to not necessarily win the nomination, but more importantly, get the base riled up. I mean, that is really going to be the key. It's not whether or not she wins, but whether when she gets to the point, unless something crazy happens, but when she gets to the point where she is facing a Republican, her base has to be excited about her. And those are the issues that are exciting people about Elizabeth Warren and not her.
She did talk about Elizabeth Warren. I thought that was very interesting, Olivia.
Well, we know they've had a couple of behind-the-scenes meetings leading up to Hillary's formal announcement of her candidacy. And she wrote a really glowing profile of Warren for the Time 100, I guess it's called, the influencers. Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to Dana's point, right? That she has to be seen as being on board with Warren in certain ways. And what better way than to praise Warren's commitments to reining in Wall Street, to helping the little guy, et cetera, et cetera. It was really an extension of that same campaign message that she's going to be hammering throughout the campaign. Maybe even if she gets a challenger.
And if I could just add real quick,
Sure.
Part of the challenge that she has is that the Wall Street Journal actually did an analysis of the donations that she and her husband have gotten, and also the money she's gotten from speeches over the past couple of decades. $1 billion from Wall Street. $1 billion. That's going to be hard to shake when she's trying to then turn to these Democratic grassroots activists who are saying Wall Street is just, eating us alive when we're the average everyday worker.
And she's also not going to give back any of the money she's gotten from foreign countries, John.
No, and the Clinton Foundation is going to continue accepting money from foreign countries. And that's on one level understandable, given the work that the Clinton Foundation does. It makes sense that they would take money from overseas, but it's a potential conflict that she's going to have to address, and certainly her opponents will throw at her. And as Dana just suggested, both the donations and the pay that she's received from Wall Street are going to be sources of Republican barbs about hypocrisy.
And what about Florida Senator Marco Rubio jumping into the race? What's he saying?
Well, it's really, really interesting to listen to Marco Rubio on the campaign trail because his message is so heavily anchored in his biography. He's a young candidate. He's 43. He talks about his family's experience. His parents were Cuban immigrants to the United States. And so it was very interesting to hear him talk about biography as a stand-in for his campaign message, talking about opportunity. The way he's going to play the concerns about income inequality, I think, were evident in his rollout speech at the Freedom Tower. He made it very clear that he's going to talk about opportunity, about guaranteeing opportunity for all. So that's a classic Republican theme, right? It's equality of opportunity, not of outcome. He's going to talk a lot about, there are a lot of red meat Republican issues in his announcement. He's a defense hawk, a national security hawk. He talked in veiled terms about opposing abortion. But the really interesting thing is to watch him try to set himself apart from not just Hillary Clinton, but his own Republican field by saying, hey, look, I'm young.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are these old people in the race. I'm not one of them. It was really, really interesting.
All right. And if you'd like to see some young people, we are video streaming today's first hour. You can go to drshow.org, click on live and see the gang at work. What about Chris Christie? I was interested in his conversation with Matt Lauer this week, John.
Chris Christie's trying to elbow his way back into this conversation. He's seen Ted Cruz announce. He's seen Marco Rubio announce Hillary Clinton. And by the way, just on Marco Rubio, he's an exceptionally good communicator. And he's somebody, without speaking the words, sort of oozes compassionate conservatism, which was George W. Bush's mantra in 2000. He's somebody who says, I can give opportunity to other people like me. But there was a very interesting point with Janet's colleague, Jake Tapper, who questioned him and said, wait, you made this not so subtle point about being the candidate of tomorrow, not yesterday, but aren't some of your policies of yesterday? He's going to have to deal with that conundrum. But Chris Christie tried to get back into the game by saying, I am a straight talker. I will tell you things that are true, even if you don't want to hear them. And one of those things is we've got to restructure Social Security. He's been very badly damaged, but he is making a play using his persona, which is his strong point, to try to say, hey, don't forget about me. I still might do this. And the emphasis is on might. We don't know for sure.
But how in the world would the public react to a man who's saying we really have to do something about Social Security and Medicare, Dana?
Well, I think just to John's point, if people are honest with themselves, looking at the raw numbers, we do have to do something about Social Security and Medicare. And what he's trying to do, Chris Christie, very much is follow the John McCain resurrection model of 2007, 2008, where he was kind of left for dead politically, and he had so many problems, but he came back by playing to his strengths, going to New Hampshire, doing town halls, and telling it like it is, and telling people things that they don't necessarily want to hear, but things that need to get done. Social Security and Medicare being a prime example.
So this weekend in New Hampshire, who's going to be there, Olivier?
Oh, it's going to be a bit of a cattle call in New Hampshire now. It's, you were talking, your correspondent you referred to earlier in the show, the person who's already tired of 2016. Yeah. I would love to know whether they live in New Hampshire, because it's on. To the Christie point, our Matt Bai at Yahoo News did an interview with one of the first interviews in this latest wave of Christie Resurrection tour. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was he talked about how he'd been under pressure to run in 2012. Mm-hmm. And Matt said, well, okay, so what's different? And he said, well, I wasn't ready then, and I'm ready now. And he came really, really, really close to
saying he was in, but not quite.
Right. But so if you're in New Hampshire where they expect to meet the candidates, 4, 5, 6 times, this is a good weekend to do it.
Isn't George W. Bush also expected to be there this weekend?
I think he is. And he's been talking about his brother. He's been making some very interesting comments about Jeb. I thought they were a little bit misread. The headline was, "My brother has a problem, me." But then the rest of the speech, if you look at it, it's actually a very warm endorsement, which of course you would expect. But from that headline, you wouldn't necessarily conclude it.
And the Bushes have a very complicated history in New Hampshire, very complicated, because it was the place where the father, George H.W. Bush, at one point fizzled out, but at another point, because he thought he had the big mo coming from Iowa, and then he didn't get that mo. But then he actually did well beating back Pat Buchanan. And then you can say the same thing about George W. Bush. Remember just talking about John McCain. He he sort of wiped the floor. John McCain wiped the floor with George W. Bush, and voters are a little bit mixed in New Hampshire about the Bushes.
And finally, very quickly, John Harwood, has Hillary scared everybody else away in the Democratic Party?
No, but the issue isn't whether she's going to be the nominee. It is whether other people are going to decide to use 2016 as their chance to either try to shift the dialogue or make their own name in the race. I think she scared them in the sense of thinking they have a chance to win the nomination.
John Harwood, Chief Washington Correspondent for CNBC. Short break. We'll be right back. Our Friday News Roundup this week with Dana Bash, Chief Congressional Correspondent for CNN, Olivier Knox at Yahoo News, John Harwood of CNBC. One person we forgot to mention in that total picture thus far is Bernie Sanders. What's happening with Bernie Sanders, Olivier?
Bernie's doing what John Harwood just alluded to, which is trying to shift the Democratic Party conversation to the left a bit, and also stake out some space for himself to build his own name, to build his own clout. One thing about Bernie, one of my colleagues dug into his appeal and found that Bernie has more reach on social media, notably on Facebook, more likes and other measures than every other politician in the field.
And
he's hugely, and Facebook calculated that when he puts something on his page, he reaches more people than the White House.
That's incredible. That's incredible. They have huge media reach. Now, somebody who doesn't have that kind of social media reach, or probably any reach, is Lincoln Chafee. However, the Republican turned independent turned Democrat, is former governor now of Rhode Island, is now all but in. Running for the Democratic primary. I interviewed him on Sunday on State of the Union, and he said point blank, his primary reason for running is still about the 2002 Iraq vote. He was famously at the time a Republican, the only Republican to vote against it. And he says that disqualifies Hillary Clinton. Now, is he going to get that kind of traction? Probably not, but his goal is to stand on the stage with Hillary Clinton and pull her to the left. He says it point blank.
Well, and if we're going down the list, you've also got Martin O'Malley, the former governor of Maryland, who has an entirely different agenda from these others. He wants to stake a claim to a future in the National Democratic Party, whether on the ticket this year or or down the road. So he is probably the most likely to mount what looks like a real challenge to Hillary Clinton, I would say. But you've also got Jim Webb, former senator from Virginia, who famously warned before the Iraq War. Lincoln Chafee voted against it. Jim Webb wrote an op-ed that said, if we go into Iraq, we're going to be there for 30 years. Looking very prescient now, and he wants to have his voice heard. Don't know whether he can raise enough money to really stay in for a long time.
All right, let's turn away from the election, but turn toward the cameras. And if you'd like to see the Friday News Roundup, you can go to drshow.org, click on Watch Live. Dana Bash, the Congress has finally done something on Medicare. Tell us what it's all about.
You could have just ended that sentence with "I finally done something," right? And that would have been a big headline. That's right. So it's called the Doc Fix, which effectively it was kind of a quirk in the law, which the Congress had to fix over and over again on an annual basis when it comes to Medicare payments to doctors. And it was and is very costly. The headline is they've fixed that, and they did it as part of a bipartisan negotiation between John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi. I mean, two of the unlikely partners in any negotiation. I mean, the two barely even spoke.
So how did this happen?
They actually just decided we got to do this. They picked up the phone. They met in person. They picked up the phone and did it mano a mano a lot. Then their staffs also worked with them, and they did it by the Democrats.
Wait, how did Nancy Pelosi go mano a mano?
All right.
We're speaking euphemistically here.
They did it.
So they did it, and the way they did it is because Democrats were able to get money for child help in terms of money for poverty, for food stamps, for things like that.
So there were
trade-offs, which is stop the presses, the way it's supposed to work. It's the art of legislating.
And also, Diane, I do think this is a big deal that all sides, Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, John Boehner, Barack Obama, deserve credit for. This was a headache for Congress every year. Republicans are now in control. They wanted to make that headache go away. They constantly were having to find money to raise these reimbursements for doctors. And they did that. They enacted some payment reforms for doctors aside from the spending levels. I think this was one of those things that we don't pay enough attention to when good news, positive things happen.
Yeah.
And they apparently overcame what on every other issue seemed to be these constant theatrical procedural hurdles, which is the other really interesting thing. I mean, you would have thought 5 years ago, if you told me 10 years ago that the Congress would fight over raising the debt limit, I would have just not believed it. And yet we had that. And in this round, 92-8 vote in the Senate seems to be going really smoothly. It's as though everyone agreed they needed to get something done.
Yeah. And the reason for that, 2016, there have to be some compromises for Republicans, I think, to make sure they are looking as though they're leading.
Exactly. And it's not just for the White House. If you look at the map in the Senate in particular, the House looks like it's, unless something dramatic happens, kind of in Republican hands for the near future. But the Senate, the flip side of what we saw in 2014 is going to happen in 2016, meaning the most defended seats are Republican seats, and Republican seats in some swing states. So they're actually a little worried, understandably so, that they can keep their majority, at least keep it as big as it is. So they've got to prove that they can govern.
That's why we're going to have a huge grand bargain on taxes, Social Security, and Medicare sometime next year. Sorry, just kidding.
Oh,
I was like, what?
Yeah, but what about estate taxes, John? They are talking about estate taxes.
That's just pressing a familiar Republican point. That's not going to go anywhere. They're not going to get rid of the estate taxes.
But what about Congress's role in the Iran deal?
Boy, that's really interesting. This week, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee unanimously approved legislation from its chairman, Tennessee Republican Bob Corker, that essentially says that the Congress will have a right to vote on a future Iran nuclear agreement. Doesn't say they have to, And it certainly stops well short of derailing the negotiations. What was really, really striking to me was what a climb down this is from where we were with Republican rhetoric 6 months ago, where they were talking about imposing new sanctions or imposing legislation that would automatically trigger sanctions if there were no agreement. Such a climb down to something that is really relatively mild, so mild that Josh Earnest, the White House press secretary, got up the day that this compromise on the legislation was announced and said, "Oh, veto threat, forget it. No, yeah, we'll sign that."
Yeah, exactly. But you talk about the climb down from Congress. What about the White House?
Thank you. That's exactly what I was just going to say. There's a climb down, no question, for Congress, but a climb up for the White House. They didn't want to have Congress getting their fingers in this Iran pie. They didn't want to have anything to do with that. They just wanted to do their own thing. So the question that I asked as soon as this deal happened, unbelievable, unanimously with the White House involved, is how did it happen? And the answer I got was the Ayatollah, because there was so much rhetoric and contradictory rhetoric on what this deal really meant. Never mind within the Iranian government, but what we heard from Iran and what we heard from the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, that a lot of members of Congress who were willing to give the administration the benefit of the doubt said, hold on a second, if we don't even know what the real deal is now, what's going to happen in just a couple of years? Maybe we should take a breath and take a look at this.
Bottom line, the administration wanted to make sure they were not in a situation where Congress could block the deal, and Congress is not going to block the deal.
Congress is not going to block the deal.
Not in this round. Not in this round.
Okay.
If they get one.
If they get one. So it's still a rolling.
June 30th is the day.
And let me just quickly say, be careful what you wish for, because Congress having its stamp on the deal means Congress has ownership over the deal. And that's not always something that in the long term they're going to want to have.
But we talked about the debt limit. I talked about the debt limit before, but and this new arrangement looks like that, because it lets the critics potentially vote against a deal in a resolution of disapproval. So they could have cover. They could have political cover and say,
That's exactly the link that I was thinking of on this deal, where the Republicans can vote against it. As long as enough Democrats are willing to say, I'm standing with the president, he'll be okay.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Let's talk about Loretta Lynch. And before we get too excited about congressional attitudes changing and people working together, what's happening with Loretta Lynch?
She's been held up for quite a long time.
As the next Attorney
General, which is, of course, extended Eric Holder's stay in the job. Republicans don't like Eric Holder very much, but as it may. Harry Reid this week in an interview with Rachel Maddow said that he was going to, if they don't confirm her soon, he was going to adopt a procedural technique to force a vote. Republicans say they can stop that and hold their people against a key element of that deal. But the interesting response from Republicans was, one, from McConnell's office, well, we're about to resolve this human trafficking bill that has been holding up the confirmation. And you also had Jeb Bush out there on the campaign trail saying, I support the confirmation of Loretta Lynch and she shouldn't be held up. That's a straw in the wind and a sign that Republicans really can't hold this indefinitely. And that's what Harry Reid was pointing to.
It was interesting to me that the White House is accusing Chuck Grassley of being totally duplicitous on this.
I say this with respect to Josh Earnest. I think that's a little bit of a sideshow, and perhaps the White House wanting to get in and be able to claim victory on something that's already happening. Meaning, I was walking the halls yesterday reporting on this in the Capitol, and they're very close to a deal. And my sense is that perhaps the deal is all but done, but they don't want to have it hang out over the weekend to have everybody throw arrows at it.
What is the deal?
So the deal is, as John just mentioned, the only reason Loretta Lynch is being held up isn't because she doesn't have the votes. Our understanding is she does have the votes. She just needs 51. Mitch McConnell said, we're not going to put her on the floor until we resolve human trafficking, which is a very important piece of legislation in and of itself. It's got bipartisan support to deal with a very unbelievable epidemic in this country. That has been mired in differences over abortion and over the so-called Hyde language, which it says no federal money can be used for abortion unless in terms of rape and incest. So my understanding is Democrats and Republicans are very close to a deal to sort of thread the needle in a lawyerly way on that. What that will mean is human trafficking will eventually pass, probably next week, and it'll pave the way for Loretta Lynch finally.
Why are the two connected?
Because Mitch McConnell decided to connect them.
That's
the most.
exactly.
I mean, it's interesting to me. That is sort of the immediate cause, but Republicans have been wrestling with Lynch for some time now.
Of course they have.
Because this was so the White House, as the White House will happily tell you, to the 160th day since she was nominated and the 50th since she was voted out of committee, which is, and I quote, over twice as long as the previous 7 attorneys general combined. But the Republicans have been struggling for a lot of reasons, one of which is that she's going to come in. She testified in a confirmation hearing that she quite predictably doesn't think that Obama's unilateral actions on immigration are illegal. And she just gave Republicans no satisfaction on a range of issues that they've hounded the president over for years. So yeah, the proximate cause is this sexual trafficking fight. But I realize you asked the questions on your show, but I'd love to know, to the extent that how are Republicans going to reconcile themselves, the few who may vote for her, how are they going to reconcile the politics of this?
It's going to be hard. Lindsey Graham in particular, he's running for president, all but running for president. He voted for her in committee, and I just was talking to him last night. He's going to vote for her on the Senate floor, and he is ready to get pummeled by Republican voters.
I think it's not hard. I talked to Orrin Hatch a couple of weeks ago, and he said her resume as a prosecutor is spotless.
All right, and you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Okay, we've got to talk about this postal employee who, we don't have this up on our screen. We've got you all on our screen, but we watched this postal employee fly in apparently under the radar and land near the Capitol. And what did Lindsey Graham have to say?
Well, everyone is out there saying, how could this possibly have happened? What a security lapse, And Lindsey Graham came and said that it should have been shot down. Well, I actually, I don't remember if he said explicitly how, but the reference was to the various surface-to-air missiles around D.C. There's one that overlooks the White House on one of the office buildings there. There's one not too far from the Capitol. There's one, I believe, physically at the Pentagon.
Was he thinking about tourists or not?
Well, obviously there are sort of second order consequences if you fire high explosive and detonate it in the skies over the National Mall at the height of cherry blossom season. But I suppose perhaps some of the good folks from Topeka might have been collateral damage.
Well, here's an email on that issue from Mike in St. Petersburg. The Tampa Bay Times had knowledge of the stunt before it occurred. It seems to me a line might have been crossed. There's a difference between reporting the news and not reporting a possibly serious crime when you know it will occur. Dan.
It's difficult, and it's a big, big question. I think that listener is exactly right. Look, the Secret Service apparently knew about this guy, went and talked to him. Not directly before his stunt, but I believe a couple of years ago, and they determined that he wasn't a threat. Now, fast forward to a couple of days ago, the question is, how do they not, if they knew that he was out there, how do they not stop him? And more importantly, to your point, it is, and I'm not even sure what to say about it as a reporter, except that if you know something like this, which could, if there's a consequence that you don't realize is going to happen, what do you do as a reporter? Do you wait for it to happen and then call midair, which is what this reporter did, or do you alert the authorities before this guy takes off?
John.
I have a conflict of interest because the Tampa Bay Times is where I started my career, my former newspaper. I first of all, the entire stunt is idiotic and insane. I'll just start with that. Second of all, I think Dan is right. It is the responsibility of the authorities to police the airspace and that's what law enforcement and aviation enforcement is about. I don't think it's necessarily the newspaper's responsibility. What I don't know is how deeply involved was the newspaper in this stunt in terms of planning it, participating for purposes of its own story? I don't know the answer, but ultimately it's law enforcement who has to take care of this.
He took off from Pennsylvania, and I disagree with you, John. I really think it was their responsibility to report on it and make sure it didn't happen. Short break, right back. Your hundreds of emails, your tweets, your comments. Here's the definitive one from Kelly in Dallas, who says, "Dear friends, mano a mano is Spanish for hand to hand, as in street fighting. I do believe that in politics, Nancy Pelosi could go mano a mano with just about anyone."
Okay, may I say, first of all, I'm humbled. I have been exposed for my complete lack of Spanish, and I'm glad to know that it is possible for me to go mano a mano with Donna Besh.
Okay, here we go.
Well done.
Let's open the phones now. 800-433-8850. First to Richard in Fort Myers, Florida. You're on the air.
Yes, Diane, my question was originally going to be regarding Jim West, but being as how you mentioned the helicopter or the gyrocopter guy, my question is, what about the corruption in Washington with the Senate and the Congress? How do these guys get so rich? And when they do leave office, do they still get the contributions that have been sent in that they haven't used yet?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, many members of Congress are rich when they come to Washington. One of the challenges of our political system right now is you need money to be elected, and people with money find it easier to get in and run. I believe the laws have been changed so that it is not any longer possible for you to keep campaign funds for personal use. It once was legal. I think you can dispose of that money as you wish. You can give it to charitable organizations, but I don't believe that lawmakers can keep the campaign money after they leave.
Any other comments? Okay, to Marion in Southern Pines, North Carolina. You're on the air.
Yes, good morning, all.
Hi.
Well, tomorrow I will be attending the Moore County, North Carolina Democratic Convention, and I have been voting as a Democrat for 51 years. I am all in for Hillary for 2016 as I was in 2008, and I find it fascinating and disturbing, really, how the media seems to try to, make news by being so critical of Hillary, of just everything, her hair, what she hasn't said, and so on. And anyway, I'm just a very enthusiastic base supporter of Hillary. So
Marion, let me ask you something.
Sure.
Did you hear that kind of criticism here this morning?
No, I did not hear it
Good.
this morning necessarily. But
I'm
I mean,
glad.
there were little things like, there's just, something. It's almost like the media tries to make Elizabeth Warren her opponent. And actually, on NPR recently, one of your correspondents reported that when Hillary goes to New Hampshire, Elizabeth Warren will be there to greet her, to welcome her, and to endorse her. So we can just, kind of clear that up. I was the first person to call Elizabeth Warren on her first day in office to congratulate her. And I claim her as one of my senators.
Good for you. And I take your point. I think that Hillary does get a lot of criticism because she's been around for a long time.
Yeah, and there is a dynamic in the media of wanting a race, right? No one really likes a coronation in the media. We like the conflict. We like this. So I would actually take that point more. I mean, if you remember the last go round, how the media would alight on this or that marginal Republican saying, well, okay, it's not Romney. It could be this other guy who has a 3% and who's all the way up to 3% in the polls. So I take the point that we are, sometimes a little quick to try to stoke the fire a little bit.
And as the only female guest, I will just also pick on, actually agree with what the caller said about talking about her hair. It's an unfortunate issue when you have a woman running, and it's just a completely different standard. And it's one I think we all have to work very, very hard to balance.
And
Your hair looks great this morning, by the way.
And so does yours, just to keep
not
balance.
To talk about clothes and not to talk about weight and not to talk about things that
you don't talk about with most male candidates.
Exactly.
But in fairness, though, Diane, any number of Republican candidates will tell you that Republican candidates get a heck of a lot of criticism from and challenge from the media as well.
All right, let's go to Palm Coast, Florida. Hi, Susan, you're on the air.
Yes, hi, Diane. Like your previous caller, well, I've been a Democrat 50 years. I'm not a Hillary fan. Last week, when she was speaking at some event, Hillary said, and I quote, "There's a special place in hell for women who don't help women." Well, for me, if I choose to help a woman or a man, it's a personal choice. To phrase it the way she did was using the gender card, and I resent it. I also received 2 letters from the Clinton Foundation signed by Hillary asking for a contribution. I'm on Social Security, and I thought it was colossal nerve to ask for money for the Clinton Foundation.
Interesting. Clearly not a Clinton supporter, and there are lots of those out there.
There are lots of those out there, and it's going to make Hillary Clinton, as I said at the beginning, it's going to make not necessarily a real race on the Democratic side for the Democratic nomination, but it could put into question the enthusiasm that she has in a general election.
All right, let's talk for a minute about the minimum wage and what's happening there. Whether we are going to get this Congress to do anything on this issue now, John.
I think it's unlikely, but not impossible. You have to see where the Republicans in Congress think they are as they move into 2016. Is this something that would help those many Republican senators running in states that aren't staunchly Republican states? You've got Illinois and several other, Pennsylvania, other states that are more purple or blue states where they're running. But of course, as the president has noted many times, you do have a movement going around in states across the country and in corporations that are responding to not only, they're not responding to exhortations from the White House, they're responding to a tightening labor market. And so this is happening organically to some extent. The question is whether there's enough critical mass at the right time before 2016 that Congress moves.
What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. I think it's going to be very difficult in a Republican Congress to do this on a federal level, especially when you have people like Joni Ernst, a new Republican senator from the relatively purple state of Iowa, who is just flat out against changing the federal minimum wage. And that's just one example. But to your point about things happening in corporations, I love the story about Gravity Payments.
Exactly.
This 30-year-old, I believe, CEO voluntarily giving up his big fat paycheck, bringing down his salary to like 70 grand,
Right.
so that his employees would all get about that. Now, it's easy when you're 30 years old and you have a bike, as he said, and not even a girlfriend and no responsibilities and probably a lot of money in the bank. But it's a good example.
All right, let's go to Bob in Greensboro, North Carolina. You're on the air.
Hi, Diane.
Hi.
I'm calling about gyrocopter guy. Every year the Congress whom we elect passes a stack of bills about 2 inches high, and every year the bureaucracy whom we do not elect passes a stack of regulations about 9 feet high. And gyrocopter guy got a misdemeanor for violating arguably the most secure airspace in the world, but he's going to get a felony for not registering his gyrocopter and still flying it anywhere. That seems like the bureaucracy is just a little bit more like an autocracy.
What do you think?
Sure. I mean, you hear this all the time when you leave the Beltway, talk about how Washington has found ways to consolidate wealth and power here at the expense of the little guy or the little gyrocopter guy, such as depending on your take. I will say I'm not sure that the height of the stack of paper is a particularly instructive piece of information. But yeah, you hear a lot of resentments about the rulemaking process. If you go, when I go back to my home state of Vermont, and if I talk to a friend of mine who is trying to start a small business, boy, you really, as an Inside the Beltway reporter, you get an earful about really the amount of work it takes to get even a bar off the ground. Now, some of that is obviously at the state level, but these resentments are real. And and Gyrocopter was complaining about campaign finance laws, but a lot of people out there are very angry at the way Washington does business.
All right. This week marks the second anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. And at the same time, we're awaiting the jury to go back into session after the marathon is over to determine the sentence of Jonar Tsarnaev. How are they likely to look at this event, Anna?
Well, the death penalty is on the table in Massachusetts, so it is possible that be the punishment. It's hard to see how the jury actually figures this out, because the fact of the matter is that he has said something along the lines of, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, that his brother, who did die at the hands of law enforcement, kind of got the better end of the deal. So at one point, you think, okay, you want to punish him, and the ultimate punishment could be death. But if he considers that kind of not so much of a punishment as what he wants, I don't know if they're going to take that into consideration.
John?
The only thing that would surprise me is if he does not get the death penalty.
Really?
He's been convicted on a massive number of counts. I think that's where we're headed. But one interesting thing, we had a Pew poll out this week that showed that support for the death penalty in the last 20 years or so has declined by 20%. It's now in the mid-50s as opposed to the mid-70s. I think that is an interesting straw in the wind. So you're in Massachusetts. Could that somehow be filtered down into the jury's judgment? I still doubt it because of the way that tragedy struck Boston.
Well, the jurors aren't supposed to take this into account, but they might still. That the parents of one of the youngest victims of the bombing have asked the jurors not to impose the death penalty. very emotional appeal. Obviously, the kid was like 7 or 8, and they're not supposed to really take that into account, but they might still. And I think it's woven into that question that John just raised about the sea change in death penalty politics in the last 20 years or so.
All right, let's go to Mel in Sterling, Virginia. You're on the air.
Hi, I just was sort of upset because I always think of that poor lady that was mentally disturbed that thought she could just go and visit the president. And she had her baby in the car, and they surrounded her car and scared her, and she backed into one of the servicemen, and they took it as an attack and chased her down like a dog and shot her, and with the baby in the car. And now everybody's, so many incidents has happened after that, and nobody has been really punished or shot. And then you have the helicopter guy, and everybody thinks it's a joke. Well, no, it's not a joke. When you chase down a woman with a baby in the car and shoot her down like a dog in the middle of the street, and then you're going to let all these other people go? I mean, what is that all about?
I think you raise a good point, Dana.
A very good point. That was a tragedy on every level, what happened, particularly because it turns out that she seemed to be mentally unstable, this woman. And it does speak to what is now being investigated from Congress and within these law enforcement agencies, is the lack of continuity in the response to these issues.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. What about the fact that he flew in below radar? How are they going to have to reshape all of their surveillance and how they conduct it?
Yeah, there's actually an extensive web of federal agencies that cooperate on the security of airspace in Washington, D.C. The president had just left the White House aboard Marine One, so they had come slightly down from their heightened state of alert. I don't know how they're going to resolve that, because the caller mentioned that this incident is a joke. Well, it's kind of a joke only because the outcome, right? The outcome is he landed, no one got hurt. So that takes a lot of, there's sort of a collective sigh of
tension out of
there's a collective sigh of relief that sometimes manifests as humor. All I could think of was I don't remember his name, the guy who flew the plane into the White House in the Clinton era. Mm-hmm. We've seen this happen before. After 9/11, as I mentioned before, they posted these really very impressive looking surface to air missile batteries around Washington, D.C. at major spots. I don't know how they're going to resolve this. I first heard about this because one of my Yahoo colleagues was at a meeting on I guess I'd have to call it a roof deck along his route, and said, "Wait, there's a guy flying toward the Capitol in this weird helicopter looking thingy," and I can't tell when they realized that he was coming in. The authorities, I don't know when the authorities found out. And I certainly have no idea how they're going to resolve this.
Yeah,
this
don't
problem.
you think that's pretty scary?
I do. And I think it's worth remembering how difficult the job is for law enforcement, Secret Service in making decisions on how to act in that situation. Remember how much criticism the Secret Service got when the guy jumped over the fence and ran into the White House?
Of course. They
could have shot that guy as he ran across the yard. They could have loosed their dogs. They probably should have done that. But I have wondered since that episode whether or not anyone who was posing what appeared to be a threat to a major federal building like the Capitol or White House would be shot. And so in one sense, Mr. Hughes is lucky that he got out unharmed physically, but it's very tough to make decisions in those moments.
The early indications from talking to who are looking into this, and this is early, is that somehow, some way, law enforcement determined that he wasn't a threat. Now, how they could have determined that, I have no idea. It's not.
He have been carrying.
He could have been
a bomb, sort.
Biochemical weapon.
Exactly.
Anything. So that's still, again, the open question. And the fact that he was really just a few feet away from the Capitol, where you have all of the lawmakers, and really physically where it was, right behind the offices of Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell and John Boehner.
Yeah, Bash has the last word. She's congressional correspondent with CNN. John Harwood of CNBC, Olivier Knox of Yahoo News. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday.
Happy
Have a
Friday.
great weekend.
Thank you, you too. And thanks for listening all. I'm Diane Rain.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture, Susan Casey, Rebecca Kaufman, Lisa Dunn, Danielle Knight, Allison Brody, and Alex.